い事件って随分ありますけどね。いろんな事件ありますね。バスガソリン控えて昔は殺されたりなんかしたりあったりね。そう、関係なくて殺されちゃう今ね。通り魔とかね。通り魔やったやつろくなもんじゃねえの。なんとか軍事とかなんかいろいろ。腹立つねあれは。ああいうやつはただ殺すのはもったいないですよ。大体死刑とか。もったいない。やっぱりなんていうの、川端軍事残酷賞とかなんか言ってね。北海道から沖縄までツアー組んだわよ、ツアー。
That's right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back once more with Jamie Sutherland, film critic and friend of the show. You might recall that last time we had Jamie on, we discussed Takeshi Kitano's international breakthrough hit, Hanabi. Given that Jamie is the Kitano expert of our bunch, you can probably deduce that today we'll be delving into another of his films. Rather than looking forward from Hanabi, however, we're actually going to be taking things a few years back and looking at one of Kitano's important early works, 1993's Sonatine.
Hello again, it is I, the illustrious Brit himself, Jamie. Gotta say it's good to be back, guys. Without further ado, let's dive in.
As is standard for the bulk of Kitano's career, Sonatine is a crime drama, following Kitano himself in the leading role as a disenchanted yakuza, where Hanabi saw Kitano in the role of a disaffected cop who turned to a life of crime. Sonatine examines the life of a grizzled yakuza who seeks to escape from his wicked ways, only to be drawn back into the fray. Also typical of Kitano at this point in his career, rather than being a non-stop action fest, Sonatine represents a unique, meditative take on the crime film. What's more, while Sonatine predates Hanabi in terms of Kitano's international success, it was the film which effectively sowed the seeds for this later development, garnering the director a cult following abroad. Notable figures like Roger Ebert and Quentin Tarantino championed the film, putting them ahead of the curve and noting Kitano's later influence. In Japan, however, Sonatine was considered a box office bomb, which feeds into the idea that Kitano was not taken seriously within his home country until Hanabi.
Enough background though, let's jump right into the film. Murakawa, Kitano's character in Sonatine, is a middle-aged Yakuza lieutenant. Tired of the gangster lifestyle, he seeks a quick and early retirement alongside his subordinate Ken. However, the two are tasked with defusing a violent gang war between two allied clans, the Nakamatsu and the Anan, in Okinawa. Murakawa is reluctant at first, as he sees this as an opportunity to have him killed and replaced, but eventually agrees to travel to the island with Ken and an inexperienced group of young Yakuza soldiers.
Shortly upon arrival, the team is bombed and ambushed, forcing them to retreat to the seaside. From this point on, the film transitions from a violent action movie into a mellow art house comedy, as Murakawa becomes romantically involved with the mysterious Miyuki, and the soldiers engage in various pranks and beach activities. However, the fun is soon halted as an assassin arrives and swiftly kills off the majority of Murakawa's men, prompting him back into action. What ultimately awaits is a violent massacre which will finally provide closure to the drawn-out quabble.
While nowhere near as polished as Hanabi in terms of finesse, Sonatine is a striking film, showcasing Kitano's skill both behind and in front of the camera from a relatively early point in his career. In many ways, the film feels something like a dry run for later projects like Hanabi, containing a remarkably similar structure, what with the dark, violent half and the meditative, borderline surreal other half.
It is also worth mentioning that his earlier film Boiling Point shares a similar plot and setting, as it follows a tired Yakuza trying to protect a minor league baseball team by the Okinawan seaside.
This is not to say that Sonatine doesn't stand on its own merits, of course. The film is beautifully framed and shot, with subtle character writing throughout. While almost no actual violence occurs on screen, when it does, it packs a wallop. It's such a subversion of the Yakuza genre that it's clear to see both why Japanese audiences initially panned the film, and why it gained its cult following later on. In this way, Kitano was something of a visionary in how he used violence sparingly, interwoven with hard-hitting character drama, to create a seemingly new type of action and crime film. However, Kitano was in good company and lineage in forming this style, given the strong influences from the past that permeate Sonatine.
As we discussed in our previous video, Kitano's key influences include the likes of mid-20th century Japanese filmmakers such as Ozu and Suzuki. However, you might be surprised to learn that possibly the two biggest names to shape his editing style, camera techniques and narrative tropes are actually European. The men in question are none other than Jean-Luc Godard and Jean-Pierre Melville. two pioneers of French New Wave, a radical filmmaking movement established by Francois Truffaut, which rebelled against the traditional period pieces and post-war dramas coming from France at the time, and ushered in a new approach to filmmaking which has since been adopted around the world. Godard's jumpy editing, vivid cinematography, and fast-paced storytelling burst onto the scene in 1960 with his breakthrough masterpiece, Breathless. Both his and Melville's dark noir thrillers serve as a testimony to the lasting effects of cinema, as they have both been cited as two of the world's most radical and creative artistic minds. Their techniques are synonymous with influencing some of the most acclaimed and stylish filmmakers working today, most notably Quentin Tarantino and, you guessed it, Takeshi Kitano. The films I would like to discuss briefly, in particular, are Perrault Le Fou, Godard's 1965 film about a crook who angers the mob and flees to the seaside with a feisty dame, and the other, Le Samurai, Melville's defining film noir classic which follows a bored assassin trying to go clean. Sound familiar? Well, the similarities don't stop there. Godard and Kitano share a similar editing style which allows them to cut out the fat surrounding certain scenes, keeping the action in motion but what we see on the screen at a minimum. Similar to Ozu's visual ellipses technique, however I believe Kitano's knack for visual flair shares more in common with Godard and French New Wave. All three filmmakers' filmographies usually consist of gritty crime dramas following gangsters or the police that incorporate elements of dark humour and romance. Kitano's nihilistic storytelling and characterization in Sonatine is borrowed from Melville, as it follows a jaded male lead who frightens those around him with his violent and questionable methods. As an aside, I would also like to mention that Quentin Tarantino also acts as a contemporary companion to Sonatine, specifically his 1992 debut film Reservoir Dogs, as they both feature similar visual iconography and scenes of tranquility which ultimately explode with moments of extreme violence. It is also worth mentioning that in the West, the film was eventually released under Tarantino's own Rolling Thunder Pictures label.
Style and background aside, let's look into what Kitano might be trying to say with Sonatine. In examining the film, the three of us were able to come up with three main interpretations. Those being that the film is a treatise on nihilism, a statement about humanism, or an examination of biblical, mythological, and literary influences on Kitano's work.
In the case of nihilism, Murakata himself represents the bulk of the issue. His character speaks very little, and when he does, it's mostly to comment on how he hopes to leave his life of crime behind. Once he realizes that he is locked into his role within the clan, however, his dialogue turns darker. Where initially he jokes about having hope for his future, at this point he grimaces and speaks on the pointlessness of the conflict in which they are taking part.
Building on the idea of the lack of intense, deep dialogue, most of the characters within the film are named rarely, with most of them being identifiable for their personality rather than their rank or given name. We saw something similar to this in Heroic Purgatory, in which we argued that this lack of conventional naming was meant to indicate that the character's individuality didn't matter, given their communist politics. Here, however, we would postulate that the characters are almost never named because Murakawa cares so little about his situation that names simply don't matter. Until the tonal shift halfway through, there's little cause for jubilation amongst the cast. It's all frowns and dreary settings, with Murakawa not even knowing his goons until they set off for Okinawa. With so little love for his job, there's equally little need for Murakawa, or the audience for that matter, to know who he's working with.
The nihilistic feeling of the film culminates right after this tonal shift, once our anti-heroes have escaped to their beach hideaway. Given that they have to lay low for an intermediate amount of time, they go about finding ways to entertain themselves, which naturally leads to them making up games to play. While later on these games become heartfelt and humorous, they begin with Murakawa mimicking a reoccurring dream and playing Russian roulette with two of his soldiers. He's so far gone at this point emotionally that he laughs all the while, genuinely lacking any care for his own mortality, and perhaps even inviting it. As it turns out though, the revolver is empty, and Murakawa is simply laughing in the face of mortality itself. As the beach stay progresses, we transition into the more humanistic aspect of the film.
While the secondary characters border on being anonymous for the better part of the film's runtime, it's in the safe house portion of Sonatine that their individual personalities are allowed to shine through. Two of the men, brought together by the fateful mission on which they have all been sent, begin as more or less complete opposites. By this point, though, they have made fast friends with one another. Even Kitano's treatment of his men improves once the strains of his Yakuza work are removed. This brings about an interesting take on the relationships throughout the film's entirety, that these people aren't super well defined in the abstract because the film is trying to state that their personalities are more important than their names or affiliations. Thus, while the whole group is able to eventually escape their Yakuza overlords, it's not until they are alone like this that they can come into their own.
For another example of this humanism, we can look at how Murakawa treats Miyuki, the only female character in this film. When she is introduced, a man is assaulting her. Rather than taking the typical crime film approach and turning the other cheek to the plight of a woman, Murakawa saves Miyuki by simply shooting the man. Murakawa's nihilism, or perhaps his stress due to his occupation, has pushed him to the point where he will do anything for the sake of correcting injustice. His loyalty means nothing now, and he won't stand to see someone being abused in this manner.
The games following the initial round of Russian roulette also speak to the sense of humanism. Once the violence is removed and the Yakuza are more or less allowed to do whatever they like, rather than following into a life of debauchery, they instead entertain themselves by imitating paper sumo wrestlers. Again, this ties into the lack of verbal communication throughout the film, as the lot of them have learned more or less that they don't need words to bond with one another. Rather, they relate on an emotional level and through their interactions, through the physical rather than the abstract of speech.
I would like to dedicate this part of the video to my own personal interpretation of the film. Sonatine is widely observed as a meditation on death, in particularly the anticipation of it. Think Waiting for Godot, but with pistols. However, I've always drawn parallels to English poet John Milton's 17th century piece, Paradise Lost, an epic which recounts the biblical tale of Lucifer and an army of rebel angels cast from heaven after facing defeat in the angelic war. As he feels betrayed, Lucifer seeks the ultimate revenge by vowing to corrupt God's greatest creation, humanity. Murakawa shares quite a bit in common with Milton's interpretation of Satan, and I've always found this quote from Paradise Lost to be their ultimate connective tissue. Quote, "Never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep," unquote. Both figures feel disillusioned towards a group they wholeheartedly immerse themselves in to the point where no amount of justification can rectify the betrayal they feel, seeking to reign in total destruction on all parties before finally laying to rest in the afterworld, one metaphorically and one physically, as Murakawa ultimately ends his own life, after mercilessly settling the score. Comparisons to Dante's Divine Comedy can also be found throughout the film. The conference room where Murakawa extracts his revenge could be seen as Inferno, a violent and frightening place. The beach acts as a sort of purgatory for the gang, as they await either salvation in the form of being able to return to Tokyo/heaven, or damnation at the hands of an assailant. The seaside conjures up imagery of the river Styx in Greek mythology, a bridge between Earth and Hades, with the assailant who comes from Murakawa's men acting as the boatman who guides them into the afterlife.
Sonatine is a must-see for those interested in the career of Takeshi Kitano, as well as lovers of his influences, and those bored of run-of-the-mill crime flicks. As we said early on, it's not as slick and polished as some of Kitano's later works, but it's a fascinating peek into how the man developed both as a director and a dramatic actor. Check this one out if you haven't, and let us know in the comments below what other Kitano films you'd like to see us cover in the future.
Once again, I'd like to thank the two of you for providing me with this opportunity. It has been an absolute pleasure working with you two as always and discussing a film that is very dear to my heart. And hey, for those watching, if you're interested with collaborating with me in the future, I can be found on Twitter as @jservo19. Inquire at your own leisure. I'll be waiting.